I sat in the mahogany-paneled law office of Hartwell and Associates in downtown Chicago, my hands folded tightly in my lap as the leather chair creaked beneath me. The air conditioning hummed softly, but nothing could cool the tension radiating from my family members scattered around the conference table. My billionaire grandfather Harold's will reading had just concluded, and the silence that followed felt deafening. Lawyer Jonathan Hartwell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, clearing his throat as he announced the final distribution. My father, Marcus, had received $12 million, my brother Tyler got $8 million, and various cousins received between $2 to $5 million each. When Hartwell finally turned to me, his voice seemed to echo from somewhere far away. My inheritance was merely $1,000 in cash. The room erupted in cruel, bitter laughter. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk spreading across his weathered face as he watched me process the humiliation. His salt and pepper beard couldn't hide the cruel satisfaction dancing in his dark eyes. Tyler threw his head back, releasing a harsh cackle that bounced off the polished walls of the law office. At 28, my brother had always possessed our father's talent for making others feel small, and today was no exception. Well. Marcus drawled, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Looks like Grandpa finally showed everyone what he really thought of our little school teacher. He emphasized the word school teacher, like it was something disgusting he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. Tyler wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. Maybe you can frame that $1,000, sis. Put it right next to your participation trophy from community college. His expensive suit couldn't hide the meanness that had always lived in his heart. My cousin Jessica, a woman in her early 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, giggled behind her manicured hand. Oh my goodness, I feel so bad for you, Amy. I mean, what are you supposed to do with that buy groceries for a month? Brandon, Jessica's younger brother, shook his head in feigned disappointment. His voice carried the same condescending tone I remembered from childhood family gatherings. Grandfather always said actions have consequences. Guess choosing to live like a pauper finally caught up with you. I remained silent, studying the crisp bills in my hands. Something felt different about them, unusual in a way I couldn't immediately identify. While my relatives continued their celebration and mockery, I turned each bill over carefully. The serial numbers looked normal at first glance, but as I examined them more closely under the office's fluorescent lighting, I noticed something extraordinary. My grandfather Harold had written tiny numbers in letters on the margins of each bill so small and precise, they were almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The markings appeared to be made with an extremely fine tip pen, the kind Harold used for his meticulous business notes. My pulse quickened as I traced the barely visible characters with my fingertip. Tyler noticed my intense focus on the money and burst into fresh laughter. Look at her. She's counting it like there might be more hiding somewhere. Face it, Amy. You got exactly what you deserved. Nothing. Marcus stood up, straightening his tie with an air of superiority. I always told Harold you lacked the killer instinct needed for real success. You chose to waste your life teaching bratty kids instead of joining the family business. This is what happens when you turn your back on opportunity. Jessica gathered her purse, a leather creation that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. We should celebrate tonight. Dinner at that new steakhouse downtown. My treat, obviously. She glanced at me with false pity. Sorry, Amy, but I don't think they validate bus passes. As my family made plans for their expensive celebration, I continued studying the mysterious markings. The more I examined them, the more convinced I became that they formed some kind of code. Harold had been a brilliant businessman, someone who never did anything without purpose. These weren't random scratches or accidental marks. Brandon was already on his phone, presumably calling his financial advisor. I'm thinking about that yacht we looked at last summer. With $5 million, I can finally make an offer. Tyler pulled out his own phone, scrolling through luxury car websites. I've had my eye on this Lamborghini for months. Finally time to pull the trigger. The lawyer Jonathan Hartwell began gathering his papers with practiced efficiency. His expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught him glancing at me with what might have been sympathy, or perhaps curiosity. As my family continued their gloating and planning, I carefully folded the bills and slipped them into my purse. The markings were starting to make sense now. I could see what appeared to be coordinates, and beneath them words so tiny they were barely legible. First National Bank Box 847 Trust in what others cannot see. My heart hammered against my ribs as the meaning became clear. Harold hadn't just left me money, he'd left me a message. A secret that none of these cruel, greedy people surrounding me had any idea existed. I stood up quietly, smoothing down my simple black dress. While Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brandon continued making their grand plans and cruel jokes, I walked toward the door. None of them bothered to say goodbye or even acknowledge my departure. They were too busy dividing up their newfound wealth and planning how to spend it. But as I reached for the door handle, Tyler's voice cut through the air one final time. "Hey, Amy, don't forget to send us a thank you card when you buy yourself a nice dinner with that fortune." Their laughter followed me into the hallway, but for the first time since entering that office, I felt something other than humiliation burning in my chest. I felt hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as I walked toward First National Bank, my purse clutched tightly against my side. I'd barely slept, spending the night decoding Harold's cryptic message and trying to understand what he might have hidden for me to find. The bank's imposing glass facade reflected my nervous expression as I approached the entrance. Inside, the marble floors echoed with the soft conversations of early morning customers. I approached the customer service desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair looked up from her computer screen. "Good morning, I'm Patricia Williams. How can I help you today?" Her voice carried the warm professionalism of someone who'd spent years helping people navigate their financial needs. My voice trembled slightly as I spoke. "I need access to safety deposit box 847. My grandfather recently passed away, and I believe he left something for me there." Patricia's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Let me check our records. Can I see some identification and the authorization paperwork?" I handed her my driver's license and explained the unusual circumstances. "I don't have traditional paperwork, but I have this." I carefully removed the marked bills from my purse, showing her Harold's tiny notations. Patricia studied the money carefully, her eyebrows rising with surprise. "These markings are quite unusual. Let me call our manager, David Sterling. He'll know how to handle this situation." Within minutes, a tall man in his 50s appeared beside Patricia's desk. David Sterling had silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a perfectly pressed navy suit that spoke of authority and experience. "Ms. Patterson, I'm David Sterling, the bank manager. Patricia mentioned you're inquiring about Box 847. May I see those bills?" I handed him the money with trembling fingers. The moment David's eyes focused on Harold's markings, his face underwent a dramatic transformation. The color drained from his cheeks, and his professional composure cracked for just an instant. "Please follow me to my office immediately," he whispered urgently, glancing around the busy lobby as if worried someone might be watching us. David's office was a sanctuary of polished wood and leather with family photos and banking awards lining the walls. He closed the door carefully and activated a small device on his desk that I assumed was some kind of privacy protection. "Miss Patterson, your grandfather and I had been planning this moment for years. Harold knew that one day someone would come here with those exact bills marked in his distinctive handwriting. He was waiting for someone worthy to decode his message." My mouth went dry. "What do you mean, worthy?" David sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking much older than his years. Harold spent the final decade of his life watching his family very carefully. He documented everything, Ms. Patterson, every conversation, every business transaction, every moral compromise. He discovered things about your father and brother that would shock you. "What kind of things?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would be devastating. David opened a secured filing cabinet and withdrew a thick manila folder. Your father, Marcus, has been embezzling from Harold's companies for 15 years. Not small amounts, Ms. Patterson. We're talking about nearly $30 million stolen through shell corporations and fraudulent contracts. I felt the room spin around me. 30 million. That's just Marcus. Your brother Tyler has been selling insider information to Harold's competitors for the past 8 years. Every major business deal, every strategic plan, every proprietary development. Tyler has been feeding it all to rival companies for substantial payments. The damage he's caused to the family business is incalculable. We estimate Harold's companies lost hundreds of millions in potential revenue because of Tyler's betrayal. The weight of this revelation crushed down on me like a physical force. But why didn't grandfather expose them? Why didn't he stop them? David's expression grew even more serious, because Harold was a strategist, not a reactor. He knew that immediate confrontation would only drive them deeper underground. Instead, he chose patience. He gathered evidence, methodically building an ironclad case, while pretending to remain oblivious to their crimes. Evidence. Recordings, financial documents, photographs, testimony from witnesses. Everything needed to ensure justice would be served properly and completely. Harold spent his final years not just as a grandfather, but as an investigator building the most comprehensive case of corporate fraud I've ever witnessed. I struggled to process this information. The family I thought I knew was apparently nothing more than an elaborate facade hiding years of systematic theft and betrayal. David continued, his voice growing softer. But the most heartbreaking discovery was yet to come. Harold learned about your cousin's involvement just 6 months before his death. Jessica and Brandon weren't innocent bystanders. They were active participants in the conspiracy. Jessica and Brandon. My voice came out as barely a whisper. They established fake charity organizations to launder the stolen money. Your cousins have been helping your father and brother clean their illegal profits through fraudulent donations and manipulated tax write-offs. The charities exist only on paper, Ms. Patterson. Every dollar donated was immediately funneled back to offshore accounts controlled by your family members. The room felt like it was closing in around me. How long has this been going on? Based on Harold's investigation, the conspiracy began small about 15 years ago with just Marcus skimming modest amounts. But it grew larger and more sophisticated over time as Tyler and eventually your cousins joined the operation. By the time Harold discovered the full scope, they were stealing millions annually and had become incredibly careless because they believed he would never suspect his own family. I thought about the will reading about their cruel laughter and sense of entitlement. They have no idea you know any of this. None whatsoever. Harold was a master at maintaining his facade of ignorance while secretly documenting every crime they committed. They genuinely believe they outsmarted him and that their inheritance represents their reward for years of successful deception. David stood up and walked to his window, gazing out at the busy street below. Harold made me promise to wait for the right person to decode his message. He knew that whoever cared enough to examine those bills carefully would be someone with the integrity to handle what he'd discovered responsibly. But why me? I asked. Why not the authorities? Why not handle this through proper legal channels immediately? David turned back to face me, and for the first time since I'd entered his office, he smiled. Because Harold had one final plan, Ms. Patterson, and you're the only person he trusted to execute it properly. David led me down a narrow hallway I hadn't noticed during my first visit to his office, past several security doors that required his keycard and biometric scan. The basement level of First National Bank felt like entering a different world, entirely one designed for absolute privacy and security. Harold rented our largest safety deposit box 5 years ago, David explained as we walked. But what he stored there goes far beyond typical valuable items or important documents. We stopped in front of box 847, which was significantly larger than the standard boxes I'd seen in movies. David inserted 2 keys simultaneously, while I provided my identification one final time. The metal drawer slid open to reveal thick folders, recording devices, and photographs organized with military precision. Harold was methodical about everything, David said as I stared at the contents. Every document is dated, every recording is transcribed, every photograph is cataloged. He approached this investigation like he approached business with absolute thoroughness and attention to detail. I picked up the first folder labeled simply Marcus Financial Crimes. Inside were bank statements, wire transfer records, and corporate documents that painted a devastating picture of systematic theft. Page after page detailed how my father had created fictitious consulting companies, approved fraudulent invoices, and redirected company funds into personal accounts. "Look at this," I whispered, holding up a bank statement. "He transferred $2.3 million in a single month. How did nobody notice?" "Harold noticed," David replied grimly, but Marcus had been careful to target funds from different subsidiaries, keeping each theft below the threshold that would trigger automatic audits. He understood the system well enough to exploit its weaknesses. The next folder contained evidence of Tyler's espionage activities. Printed emails showed him communicating with competitors, selling confidential information about upcoming mergers, new product developments, and strategic partnerships. Some messages included actual photographs of internal documents taken with Tyler's phone. "Your brother was remarkably brazen," David observed as I flipped through the communications. He didn't even bother using code words or anonymous accounts. He conducted these transactions using his personal email and phone number. One email chain particularly caught my attention. Tyler had sold advance notice of Harold's planned acquisition of a competing company, allowing the rivals to make a counteroffer that ultimately cost Harold's business $47 million in lost opportunity. "This is treason against his own family," I said, my voice thick with disgust. "It gets worse," David warned, handing me a folder marked Extended Family Network. Inside were surveillance photographs showing Jessica and Brandon meeting with financial advisors, lawyers, and what appeared to be money laundering specialists. Harold had somehow managed to document their entire operation, from the initial establishment of fake charities to the complex web of transactions used to clean the stolen funds. The photographs were accompanied by detailed financial records showing how the fake charities operated. Donations would be made using stolen money, tax deductions would be claimed on the charitable contributions, and then the funds would be immediately withdrawn and transferred to offshore accounts. The charities never performed any actual charitable work or helped any real causes. They claimed to be feeding homeless families and funding educational programs. I read from one document, but every dollar went straight into their personal accounts. David nodded solemnly. "Your cousins were particularly creative with their schemes. They established multiple charities with similar names to legitimate organizations, confusing donors and regulators, while maximizing their ability to move illegal funds without detection." As I continued reading, I discovered that Harold had been tracking the conspiracy for much longer than David had initially indicated. Some of the earliest documents dated back 17 years, suggesting that Harold had suspected problems almost from the beginning, but had chosen to investigate quietly rather than confront the situation immediately. He was building a legal case, I realized. All of this evidence would be admissible in court. Absolutely. Harold worked with former FBI investigators to ensure every piece of evidence was collected legally and documented properly. He wanted to guarantee that when justice finally came, it would be swift and complete. I picked up a small recording device and looked questioningly at David. "What's on these conversations?" Harold began wearing recording equipment during family gatherings, business meetings, and private discussions. He has your father and brother confessing to their crimes, planning future thefts, and laughing about how easy it was to fool him. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined possible. They thought he was senile and trusting. They had no idea he was documenting everything they said and did. Harold was many things, but senile was never one of them. His mind remained sharp until the very end. He simply allowed your family to believe what they wanted to believe because it served his investigation. At the bottom of the box, I found a sealed envelope marked, "For Amy only, final instructions." My hands shook as I opened it, recognizing Harold's distinctive handwriting covering multiple pages. "My dear Amy," the letter began, "If you are reading this, it means you were the one who cared enough to decode my message and discover the truth about our family. I pray that you are strong enough to handle what I have learned and wise enough to use this knowledge responsibly." The letter continued for several pages, detailing Harold's growing suspicions, his decision to investigate privately, and his heartbreak at discovering the extent of his family's betrayal. But the final paragraphs contained information that made everything else pale in comparison. "I have terminal cancer, Amy. I have perhaps 6 months to live, but I have told no one. I am using these final months not to seek treatment that would only delay the inevitable, but to complete my investigation and ensure that justice will eventually be served. More importantly, I am using this time to make sure the family's legitimate wealth ends up in the hands of someone who will use it honorably." I looked up at David with tears in my eyes. He knew he was dying. Harold was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years ago. He declined treatment that might have extended his life by a few months because he said he had more important work to finish. He spent those final years not just gathering evidence against the conspirators, but also taking steps to protect the legitimate assets from being stolen or destroyed. The letter's final revelation was the most shocking of all. "I have discovered that Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brandon are planning to steal even more money immediately after my death. They believe they will inherit my wealth legitimately, but then they intend to loot whatever remains of the business assets and disappear before anyone notices. They have already made arrangements with offshore banks and purchased properties in non-extradition countries. They are not just thieves, Amy. They are flight risks planning to abandon everything and everyone once they have taken what they want." I set the letter down with trembling hands. "They're planning to disappear." Harold suspected as much, which is why he accelerated his investigation and made arrangements for everything you're discovering today. He knew that traditional inheritance processes would give them time to steal more money and flee the country. He needed a way to expose them quickly while protecting the legitimate assets and ensuring they face justice for their crimes. Looking back at the overwhelming evidence spread before me, I finally understood the magnitude of Harold's final plan. This wasn't just about revealing a few financial irregularities or family squabbles. This was about stopping a coordinated criminal conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything Harold had built while ensuring the guilty parties faced appropriate consequences for their actions. "What am I supposed to do with all of this?" I asked, feeling completely overwhelmed. David smiled for the second time since I'd met him. "That depends on how much you trust your grandfather's judgment, Miss Patterson. Because this is only the beginning of what he prepared for you." David reached into the back of the safety deposit box and withdrew a second sealed envelope, this one marked with today's date and my full name written in Harold's careful script. "Harold instructed me to give you this only after you had reviewed all the evidence and understood the full scope of your family's crimes." I opened the envelope with hands that had stopped trembling. Inside was another lengthy letter, but this one was different. Where the previous letter had been filled with disappointment and heartbreak, this one radiated controlled anger and strategic thinking. "My dearest Amy," I read aloud, "by now you understand that our family is not what we pretended to be. Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brandon have stolen from me for years while believing I was too old and trusting to notice their betrayal. But I have one final surprise for them, and I need your help to execute it properly." David gestured for me to continue reading. The next paragraphs detailed Harold's master plan with the precision of a military operation. "The $12 million I left Marcus and the $8 million I left Tyler represent carefully calculated amounts. Those numbers were not arbitrary, Amy. They correspond exactly to the amount of money I can prove they have stolen from me over the years. By accepting their inheritance, They are essentially confessing to the crimes while simultaneously incriminating themselves by spending money they obtained illegally. I looked up at David in amazement. He gave them back their own stolen money. "It gets better," David said with a grim smile. "Keep reading." Harold's letter continued, "The $5 million I left Jessica and the $2 million I left Brandon similarly match the amounts they laundered through their fake charities. Every dollar they received in my will can be traced back to money they stole from me through their fraudulent schemes. When they spend this inheritance, they will be spending the proceeds of their own crimes." "But how does that help expose them?" I asked. "Read the next page," David suggested. "I have spent the past 18 months working with federal investigators to document every aspect of their conspiracy. Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI Financial Crimes Division has been coordinating with me to build cases against all 4 conspirators. However, we needed them to incriminate themselves further by spending the stolen money in ways that would prove their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt." My pulse quickened as I read Harold's detailed explanation. He had deliberately given his family large inheritances, knowing they would immediately begin spending lavishly, creating a clear trail of evidence that would demonstrate their long-term pattern of criminal behavior. "The inheritance money is marked Amy, not visibly like the bills I left you, but electronically. Every dollar they received can be tracked through the banking system. When Marcus buys his yacht and Tyler purchases his sports cars, they will be generating evidence of money laundering and criminal conspiracy. Their spending will prove they knew the money was stolen, because no innocent person spends windfall inheritance money in the specific patterns that match criminal behavior." I set the letter down for a moment, trying to process the sophistication of Harold's trap. He turned their greed against them. Harold understood psychology as well as he understood business, David explained. He knew that Marcus and Tyler would immediately begin spending their inheritance on luxury items because they had always been impatient and materialistic. He also knew that Jessica and Brandon would use their inheritance to expand their money laundering operations because they had become addicted to the profits from their illegal activities. I continued reading, but the most important element of my plan concerns the legitimate wealth I accumulated through legal business activities over the past 50 years. That money, approximately $400 million, has been carefully removed from all accounts your relatives knew about and transferred into untraceable trusts that can only be accessed using the codes I marked on your $1,000 inheritance. My breathing stopped entirely. $400 million. David nodded solemnly. Harold spent 2 years secretly liquidating assets, selling properties, and transferring funds without anyone in your family noticing. Every dollar of legitimate wealth has been placed beyond their reach and preserved for you to inherit. "But why me?" I whispered. "Why not just donate it to charity or give it to other family members?" Harold's letter anticipated my question. "Because you are the only person in our family who chose integrity over wealth, Amy. You refused my offers to pay for expensive education. You declined my suggestions to join the family business, and you rejected every attempt I made to give you money or gifts. You chose to live modestly as a teacher because you wanted to earn your way through life honestly." Tears began flowing down my cheeks as I read Harold's explanation of how he had watched me struggle financially while maintaining my principles, never asking for help even when I desperately needed it, never compromising my values even when doing so would have made my life much easier. "I tested everyone in our family over the years, Amy. I offered them all opportunities to prove their character, to demonstrate integrity, to show that they valued family relationships more than money. Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brandon all failed those tests repeatedly. They chose greed over loyalty, deception over honesty, and theft over earning their own success. But you chose differently even when choosing integrity made your life more difficult." I wiped my eyes and continued reading. Harold's plan had one final element that took my breath away. "I have also planted false evidence suggesting even larger hidden assets exist, Amy. documents that Marcus and Tyler will find when they search my study after the funeral papers that suggest I have hundreds of millions more dollars hidden in secret accounts. This false evidence will drive them to become even more reckless and desperate in their search for money that does not exist. David handed me a tissue and watched as I absorbed the full scope of Harold's psychological manipulation. Your grandfather predicted that Marcus and Tyler would become obsessed with finding these non-existent hidden assets. He knew their greed would override their caution, causing them to take increasingly desperate and illegal actions that would provide federal investigators with even more evidence of their criminal intent. The final paragraphs of Harold's letter outlined the endgame. When the FBI arrests them for their crimes, they will discover that the money they have been stealing and laundering for years has been restored to its rightful place in the family wealth. The $400 million you are inheriting, Amy, includes not just my legitimate earnings, but also every dollar they stole from me, recovered through careful legal action and returned to where it belongs. I looked up at David with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He got it all back. Every penny plus interest and damages. Harold's investigation was so thorough and his evidence so overwhelming that recovering the stolen funds was relatively straightforward once law enforcement became involved. Your relatives have been spending stolen money for years, but that money was never really gone. It was just temporarily misplaced. Harold's letter concluded with instructions for me to meet with Agent Sarah Martinez, who would coordinate the final stages of the investigation and help me understand my role in bringing justice to our family. He also provided detailed information about the legitimate business assets I would be inheriting and his hopes for how I might use that wealth to help others. "There's one more thing," David said quietly. Harold left specific instructions about timing. Agent Martinez is waiting for my call. The moment I contact her, federal raids will begin at your relatives' homes and offices. Are you ready for that to happen? I thought about their cruel laughter at the will, reading their years of stealing from Harold, while pretending to love him, their plans to disappear after looting whatever remained of his life's work. I thought about all the students I could help with Harold's legitimate wealth, all the good I could do with money that had been earned honestly and preserved through his sacrifice. "Make the call," I said firmly. David Sterling reached for his secure phone line, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he dialed a number he had clearly memorized. "Agent Martinez, this is David Sterling at First National Bank. The package has been delivered. Yes, she's here with me now. We're ready to proceed." He hung up and turned to me with an expression that mixed excitement with grim determination. "Agent Sarah Martinez will be here within 20 minutes. In exactly 1 hour, coordinated raids will begin at 4 locations simultaneously. Your relatives have no idea what's about to happen." I felt a strange combination of anticipation and dread. How long has the FBI been involved? Harold contacted them 14 months ago with preliminary evidence. Agent Martinez has been building federal cases against your family members ever since, using Harold's investigation as the foundation for much larger criminal charges. Money laundering, tax evasion, wire fraud, conspiracy, and interstate transportation of stolen property. The sentences they're facing could reach 20 to 30 years each. While we waited for Agent Martinez, David showed me additional documents Harold had prepared. Financial projections showing the true value of the family business empire once the stolen assets were recovered and returned. Property deeds for real estate holdings I had no idea existed. Investment portfolios that had been carefully managed and grown over decades. Harold was worth far more than $400 million, David explained. That's just the liquid assets he transferred into your trusts. When you include the business holdings, real estate investments, and recovered stolen funds, you're looking at an inheritance worth nearly $600 million. The number was so large I couldn't really comprehend it. What am I supposed to do with that kind of money? Whatever Harold believed you would do. Use it wisely, help others, and never let it corrupt your character the way it corrupted theirs. Agent Sarah Martinez arrived precisely on schedule, a woman in her early 40s with short dark hair and the kind of confident demeanor that spoke of years handling complex financial crimes. She wore a simple black suit and carried a briefcase that looked like it had seen considerable use. "Ms. Patterson, I'm Agent Martinez. Your grandfather was an extraordinary man who provided my team with the most comprehensive evidence package we've ever received for a case of this magnitude. Thanks to his investigation, we have enough evidence to secure convictions against all 4 suspects." She opened her briefcase and removed several thick folders. Harold's cooperation allowed us to obtain additional evidence through legal surveillance methods. "We've been monitoring your family members' communications, financial transactions, and business activities for the past 8 months. "What kind of evidence?" I asked. "Phone conversations where Marcus discusses plans to steal additional assets after Harold's death. Email communications where Tyler arranges to sell more proprietary information to competitors. Bank records showing Jessica and Brandon establishing new fraudulent charities just last month. They never stopped their criminal activities, Ms. Patterson. If anything, they escalated their illegal behavior because they believed Harold's death would eliminate any chance of being discovered." Agent Martinez showed me surveillance photographs taken outside Marcus's mansion, Tyler's downtown office, and the building where Jessica and Brandon operated their fake charity network. "We've been watching them for months, documenting their continued criminal activities and waiting for the right moment to move forward with arrests." "Why wait until now?" I asked. "Because Harold insisted that you should have the opportunity to understand the full scope of their betrayal before we proceeded. He wanted you to see the evidence firsthand and make an informed decision about whether to pursue criminal charges. Under federal law, you're considered the primary victim of their conspiracy, since you are Harold's legitimate heir." The weight of that responsibility felt enormous. "What happens if I decide not to press charges?" "The federal crimes they've committed aren't dependent on your cooperation," Agent Martinez explained. "We have enough evidence to prosecute them regardless of your wishes. But Harold wanted you to understand that you have significant influence over how aggressively we pursue maximum sentences versus accepting plea bargains." David checked his watch. "The raids begin in 35 minutes. Ms. Patterson, Agent Martinez, needs to know whether you want to observe the arrests or prefer to remain here while the operations proceed." I thought about Harold's letter, his disappointment at discovering his family's true nature, his careful planning to ensure justice would be served. "I want to see what happens." Agent Martinez nodded approvingly. "We'll monitor the raids from a mobile command unit. You'll be able to watch everything without being directly involved in the arrests." As we prepared to leave the bank, Agent Martinez provided me with a final briefing about what to expect. "Based on our surveillance, Marcus is currently at his estate meeting with financial advisors about overseas investments. Tyler is at his office preparing to leave town for what he thinks is a business trip, but which we believe is actually an attempt to establish residency in a non-extradition country. Jessica and Brandon are at their charity offices, probably destroying evidence and preparing to transfer more stolen funds." "They're all planning to run?" I asked. Harold predicted they would try to flee once they had secured as much stolen money as possible. That's why timing was so critical. We needed to move before they could disappear with additional assets or establish themselves beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. David locked the safety deposit box and returned Harold's evidence to its secure location. "This material will remain here until it's needed for the trials. Your grandfather chose our bank specifically because of our security protocols and our experience handling sensitive legal documents." As we walked toward the parking garage, Agent Martinez received a radio communication from her team leaders. "All units are in position. Subjects appear to be following their normal routines, with no indication they suspect law enforcement attention. We're cleared to proceed on schedule." I climbed into the back seat of Agent Martinez's unmarked vehicle, my mind racing with thoughts about what the next few hours would bring. Harold had spent the final years of his life building toward this moment, sacrificing his relationships with his family in order to gather the evidence necessary to bring them to justice. Agent Martinez, I said as we drove through downtown Chicago traffic, what made my grandfather first suspect that his family was stealing from him. A discrepancy in quarterly financial reports about 3 years ago. Harold noticed that certain subsidiary companies were showing unusual expense patterns that didn't match their operational activities. When he investigated personally instead of delegating to Marcus or Tyler, he discovered the first evidence of fraudulent invoicing and ghost employees. And that led to everything else. Harold realized that if Marcus was willing to steal relatively small amounts through fake invoices, there were probably larger crimes being committed. He decided to investigate comprehensively rather than confront the immediate problems, which led to discovering the full scope of the conspiracy. As we approached the mobile command unit, I could see multiple law enforcement vehicles positioned strategically around the city, all waiting for the coordinated signal to move simultaneously against targets who had no idea their years of crimes were about to catch up with them. "Ms. Patterson," Agent Martinez said as we parked, "are you sure you're ready for this? Watching your family members get arrested is going to be emotionally difficult, even knowing what they've done." I thought about Harold's sacrifice, about the students I could help with his legitimate inheritance, about the importance of ensuring that justice was finally served after years of betrayal and theft. "I'm ready," I said firmly. "Let's finish what my grandfather started." The mobile command unit was a sophisticated operations center packed with monitors, communication equipment, and federal agents coordinating the simultaneous raids. Agent Martinez positioned me where I could observe everything while remaining safely away from the actual arrests. "Team Alpha is approaching Marcus Patterson's residence," came the first radio report. On the main monitor, I watched unmarked vehicles surround my father's sprawling estate in the exclusive Winnetka neighborhood. The mansion looked even more impressive from the aerial surveillance footage than I remembered from family gatherings. "Team Beta is in position outside Tyler Patterson's office building," reported another voice. A second monitor showed federal agents preparing to enter the downtown high-rise, where my brother conducted his supposedly legitimate consulting business. "Teams Gamma and Delta are ready at the charity office locations," came the final confirmation. 2 additional monitors displayed the modest office buildings where Jessica and Brandon operated their fraudulent organizations buildings that looked entirely innocent from the outside. Agent Martinez spoke into her radio with calm authority. "All teams, you are cleared to execute. Operation Family Tree is now active." I watched in fascination as the raids began simultaneously across the city. At Marcus's estate, agents approached the front door while others moved to secure the rear exits and garage areas. The door opened to reveal my father in his expensive golf attire, his face transforming from mild curiosity to absolute shock as federal agents displayed their badges and arrest warrants. "Marcus Patterson, you are under arrest for money laundering conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, and interstate transportation of stolen property," I heard through the audio feed. Marcus's mouth opened and closed silently as agents read him his rights and placed handcuffs around his wrists. On the second monitor, Tyler's arrest was equally dramatic. Federal agents had entered his office building and cornered him in his private conference room where he had been meeting with what appeared to be offshore banking representatives. Tyler attempted to run toward a back exit but found agents already positioned to intercept him. "Tyler Patterson, you are under arrest for corporate espionage conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and violation of interstate commerce regulations." My brother's expensive suit couldn't hide his panic as he realized his carefully planned escape route had been anticipated and blocked. The arrests of Jessica and Brandon were happening simultaneously at their respective charity offices. Both had been in the middle of destroying documents when federal agents arrived, providing additional evidence of consciousness of guilt and obstruction of justice charges. "This is incredible," I whispered as I watched my relatives being led away in handcuffs. "They really had no idea you were watching them." Agent Martinez nodded grimly. Harold's investigation was so discreet that they never suspected federal law enforcement had become involved. They believed they had successfully deceived an elderly man and that his death would end any possibility of discovery. Over the next hour, I watched as federal agents methodically searched each location, seizing computers, financial records, and physical evidence. The amount of material being collected was staggering, filling multiple vehicles at each site. Team Alpha has secured approximately $200,000 in cash from Marcus Patterson's home office, came one report. The money was hidden in a wall safe, along with falsified business documents and what appear to be additional offshore account numbers. Team Beta has confiscated Tyler Patterson's computers and discovered evidence that he was planning to leave the country tonight, reported another agent. His office contained airline tickets, foreign bank account information, and documents suggesting he intended to establish permanent residence in a non-extradition nation. The evidence of flight risk was particularly damning because it supported Harold's prediction that the conspirators would attempt to flee once they had maximized their theft from his estate. Agent Martinez turned to me with a satisfied expression. Your grandfather's psychological profile of your family members was remarkably accurate. Marcus and Tyler both acted exactly as he predicted they would, providing us with additional evidence of criminal intent and consciousness of guilt. What happens now? I asked. Arraignments will be held tomorrow morning. Based on the evidence we've collected and the flight risk factors, I expect all 4 defendants will be denied bail. The federal prosecutors handling this case believe they can secure plea agreements within 60 days or proceed to trial with an extremely strong likelihood of conviction. As the raids concluded, Agent Martinez showed me preliminary reports from the searches. Marcus's home had contained evidence of additional financial crimes that hadn't been discovered during Harold's investigation. Tyler's office revealed plans for future espionage activities and communications with foreign competitors interested in purchasing more proprietary information. The scope of their criminal activity was even larger than Harold realized, Agent Martinez explained. Your family members were planning to expand their illegal operations significantly, using their inheritance as seed money for more sophisticated money laundering and espionage schemes. Jessica and Brandon's charity offices had yielded evidence of multiple new fraudulent organizations in development, suggesting they had been planning to use their inheritance to establish an even more extensive network of fake charities for laundering stolen funds. If Harold hadn't stopped them when he did, your relatives might have stolen hundreds of millions more dollars over the next few years, Agent Martinez observed. As evening fell over Chicago, I found myself back in David Sterling's office at First National Bank, reviewing the final documents Harold had prepared for this moment. The legitimate family wealth was now completely secure and under my control, while the stolen assets had been recovered and would be returned to their rightful place in Harold's estate. There's one final element to Harold's plan, David said, withdrawing a last sealed envelope from his personal safe. This was to be opened only after the arrests had been completed successfully. Inside was a brief letter and a set of keys. Harold's final message was simple but profound. Amy, by now you understand the true cost of greed and the value of integrity. The keys in this envelope open a building I purchased 6 months before my death. The address is written below. I believe you'll find it interesting. The address was in my school district just 3 blocks from where I taught elementary students from low-income families. David drove me there as the sun set over the city, and I was amazed to discover that Harold had secretly purchased the entire complex of buildings that housed our struggling public school. He bought the school, I asked in disbelief. Not just the school, David replied, handing me additional documents. Harold purchased the surrounding properties and established a $50 million educational foundation to support students from disadvantaged backgrounds. He intended for you to manage the foundation and use it to provide opportunities for children whose families couldn't afford quality education. As I stood in front of the school where I had taught for 5 years, struggling with inadequate resources and overcrowded classrooms, I realized that Harold had been watching my work and planning this surprise for months before his death. He wanted to support what you were already doing, David explained. Instead of trying to change your career or convince you to join the family business, he decided to enhance your ability to help students by providing the resources you needed to make a real difference. Harold's final letter concluded with words that brought tears to my eyes. You chose education over wealth, integrity over comfort, and service over selfishness. Now you have the resources to pursue your calling without the financial constraints that have limited your impact. Use this inheritance wisely, help as many children as possible, and never forget that true wealth comes from the positive difference you make in other people's lives. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated lobby of what was now officially known as the Harold Sterling Academy for Educational Excellence, watching as students from across Chicago arrived for their first day at a school that would change their lives forever. The transformation had been remarkable not just in the physical building, but in the educational opportunities we could now provide. With Harold's inheritance and the recovered stolen funds, we'd created something extraordinary. The academy offered full scholarships to students from low-income families, providing not just excellent education, but also meals, transportation technology access, and college preparation programs that most of these children could never have imagined accessing. Ms. Amy called out 8-year-old Maria Santos as she ran toward me with excitement. "I can't believe we have our own computers now." Her joy was infectious, and I couldn't help but smile as she showed me the new tablet each student received for their studies. The morning news was playing on the television in our main office, and I caught a glimpse of the final chapter in my family's legal saga. Marcus had been sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for money laundering, conspiracy, and tax evasion. Tyler received 20 years for corporate espionage and fraud. Jessica and Brandon each got 15 years for their roles in the money laundering conspiracy. All of their assets had been seized and distributed according to federal restitution guidelines, with the majority being returned to Harold's legitimate estate. None of them would be eligible for parole for at least 12 years, and their criminal convictions ensured they would never again be able to work in financial services or corporate management. "It's finally over," said David Sterling, who had become not just a financial advisor, but a close friend throughout this entire process. He visited the academy regularly to check on our progress and help manage the educational foundation Harold had established. "Not over," I replied, watching our students settle into their new classrooms. "Just beginning. This is what Harold really wanted. Not revenge against his family, but opportunity for children who needed someone to believe in them." Agent Martinez had stopped by earlier that morning to deliver the final financial reports. The recovery operation had been completely successful, returning every stolen dollar to its proper place, while ensuring that my relatives faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. "Your grandfather would be proud," she had said, "not just because justice was served, but because of what you're doing with his legacy." I walked through the academy's halls, observing classes that Harold's generosity had made possible, advanced science laboratories where students conducted experiments with equipment most public schools couldn't afford, art studios filled with supplies that allowed creative expression to flourish, a library stocked with thousands of books and staffed with reading specialists who worked with students individually. In our computer lab, I found 15-year-old James Wilson working on coding projects that could lead to technology scholarships at major universities. 6 months ago, James had never touched a computer because his family couldn't afford one. Now he was learning programming languages that might change his entire future. Ms. Amy called out our head counselor, Patricia Chen. "The university admissions officers from Northwestern are here for the college preparation meeting." Thanks to Harold's Foundation, we could offer college counseling services that helped our high school students navigate admission processes and financial aid applications. Many of our seniors were already receiving acceptance letters from prestigious universities with full scholarships made possible through the educational fund Harold had created. As I walked toward the meeting, I passed the framed photograph that hung in our main hallway. Harold Sterling smiling beside a group of students he'd quietly sponsored for years before his death. Few people had known about his charitable activities because he had always preferred anonymous giving. The college counseling session was inspiring to observe. Students who had grown up believing university education was beyond their financial reach were now discussing their dreams of becoming doctors, engineers, teachers, and business leaders. Harold's legacy wasn't just about the money he had left. It was about the hope and opportunity he had provided to young people who needed someone to invest in their potential. During lunch, I sat in my office reviewing thank you letters from parents whose children now had educational opportunities they had never imagined possible. One mother wrote about her daughter's newfound confidence in mathematics after receiving tutoring support through our program. Another father described how his son had discovered a passion for creative writing in our enhanced English classes. The $1,000 in marked bills that had started this entire journey sat framed on my office wall, a constant reminder of how Harold had tested my character while preparing to transform my life. The bills represented more than money. They symbolized the importance of paying attention to details others might overlook and the value of maintaining integrity even when it seemed unrewarded. My phone rang and I answered to hear the voice of Chicago's Superintendent of Education. Amy, I wanted to let you know that the Harold Sterling Academy has been selected as a model program for educational innovation. The Federal Department of Education wants to study your approach for potential implementation in other cities. Harold's influence was expanding beyond what even he might have imagined. Our success was inspiring similar programs across the country, creating opportunities for thousands of additional students who needed someone to believe in their potential. As the day ended and students headed home to their families, I reflected on the lessons Harold had taught me through his final plan. True wealth wasn't measured in dollars or assets, but in the positive impact you could have on other people's lives. Integrity wasn't just about avoiding wrongdoing. It was about actively choosing to do good even when nobody was watching. Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brandon had chosen greed over family deception, over honesty and theft, over earning their own success. They had traded temporary financial gain for decades in prison and the permanent loss of their freedom and reputation. But Harold had chosen differently, and his choice had created ripple effects that would continue for generations. Every student who received an education through his foundation would have opportunities to help others in turn. Every family whose financial struggles were eased through our support programs would be able to invest more in their children's futures. The greatest irony was that Harold's legitimate wealth had grown substantially since his death. The business holdings that Marcus and Tyler had tried to steal were now thriving under honest management. The real estate investments they had attempted to liquidate were appreciating in value. The foundation's endowment was generating returns that would fund educational programs indefinitely. As I locked up the academy and headed home to my own modest apartment, I smiled thinking about how different my life had become while remaining fundamentally the same. I still taught students, still focused on education, still lived, simply despite having access to enormous wealth. The difference was that now I had the resources to help far more children than ever before. Harold had been right about the power of patience and strategic thinking. Instead of confronting his family's betrayal immediately, he had chosen to gather evidence methodically while planning a response that would ensure lasting justice and positive outcomes. His approach had been more effective than any immediate confrontation could have been. Before bed, I read one final thank you letter that had arrived that afternoon. It was from Maria Santos, the 8-year-old who had been so excited about her new tablet computer that morning. Dear Ms. Amy. She had written in her careful handwriting, "Thank you for making our school so wonderful. My mama says that rich people usually don't help kids like us, but you are different. I want to be a teacher like you when I grow up so I can help other kids too. Thank you for showing us that someone believes we can do great things." That letter captured everything Harold had hoped to accomplish through his final plan. He hadn't just punished wrongdoing, He had created opportunity for good. He hadn't just recovered stolen money. He had invested in human potential. He hadn't just taught me about inheritance. He had shown me the true meaning of legacy. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I thought about Harold's final lesson, that the greatest inheritance you can leave behind isn't money or property, but the positive difference you've made in the world and the inspiration you've provided for others to continue that good work. Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brandon had believed that wealth was about taking what you wanted, regardless of who got hurt. Harold had understood that true wealth came from using whatever resources you had to lift others up and create opportunities for those who needed them most. Their story had ended with prison sentences and public disgrace. Harold's story was just beginning, living on through every student who received an education, every family whose struggles were eased, and every person who was inspired to use their own resources and talents to help others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a positive difference. Thanks to Harold's wisdom, sacrifice, and careful planning, I was ready to meet those challenges with resources, knowledge, and a clear understanding of what truly mattered in life. His legacy would continue not because of the money he had left behind, but because of the values he had demonstrated and the opportunities he had created for others to succeed through their own honest efforts and dedication to helping their communities thrive. That was the real inheritance Harold had given me. Not just financial resources, but a clear example of how to use those resources responsibly to create lasting positive change in the world. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was deceiving you, and how did you handle that betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories and perspectives on family loyalty, integrity, and the importance of doing what's right even when it's difficult. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like to help others find it. Subscribe for more inspiring stories about overcoming challenges and finding strength in difficult situations, and share this with anyone who might benefit from Harold's lessons about character, justice, and the true meaning of wealth. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and I hope Harold's story reminds you that integrity and kindness are always worth more than money, and that sometimes the smallest gestures can lead to the most meaningful changes in our lives and the lives of others.